Welcome to a Twilight Bible study here from St. Andrew's Lutheran Church in Van Nuys and Prince of Peace Lutheran Church in Northridge. Usually I record in the sanctuaries, but tonight I'm recording at home here in my backyard. Today we're going to learn about Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, the Christians at Corinth. His second letter, chapter 6, verses 1 through 13. Paul tells us, as we work together with God, we urge you also not to accept the grace of God in vain. For he says, at an acceptable time I have listened to you, and on a day of salvation I have helped you. See, now is the acceptable time. See, now is the day of salvation. We are putting no obstacle in anyone's way, so that no fault may be found with our ministry. But as servants of God, we have commended ourselves in every way, through great endurance, in afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, hunger, by purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, holiness of spirit, genuine love, truthful speech, and the power of God, with the weapons of righteousness for the right hand and for the left, in honor and dishonor, in ill repute and good repute. We're treated as impostors and yet are true, as unknown and yet we are well known, as dying and see, we are alive, as punished and yet not killed, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as poor yet making many rich, as having nothing and yet possessing everything. Spoken frankly to you Corinthians, our heart is wide open to you. There is no restriction in our affections, but only in yours. In return, I speak as to children. Open wide your hearts also. Well, to begin this section, Paul quotes from the prophecies of Isaiah chapter 49. It's called the Second Servant song. And Isaiah announces that Israel is God's servant, and that Israel, which is enslaved in Babylon, will go from being reviled and dismissed to be God's light to the Gentiles. Isaiah announces to those poor captives, it's too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the survivors of Israel. I will give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. Today we realize God just did that. Through a Jew, Jesus Christ, the ends of the earth have heard the good news of God's love for God's creation and for all humanity. Paul pointed back to a seminal moment in Jewish history when Israel was commissioned as God's servant to bring the light and love of our Father who art in heaven, even to us non-Jews. The Jews before Jesus made many converts to Judaism. Think of how on the day of Pentecost it says that Jews from all over the world were gathered into Jerusalem to worship. But now, right around 55 AD, a Jew, Paul the Apostle, was traveling freely through the Roman Empire, welcoming non-Jews to faith in the Jewish Messiah, Jesus Christ. Now, before Jesus, the Jews had made many converts, but within just a few hundred years after Christ's resurrection, the entire Roman Empire was familiar with the message of Jesus Christ and would be considered at least nominally Christian. And the good news of God's love for us through Jesus Christ was reaching out even to the pagan strongholds of places like Southern California. And Paul tells the non-Jews that now is the time to believe. Paul uses Jewish scripture to try to convince Jews that Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ, who was promised by Isaiah, and who is the salvation of God for the entire world. But Paul isn't going to lay on Christians the same old Jewish rules and laws and traditions that are always laid on the Jews. Paul makes it clear that there will be no entrance requirements, like having to get circumcised to be a Christian. There'll be no dietary requirements, like abstaining from certain foods to be a Christian. Paul writes, we're putting no obstacle in anyone's way so that no fault may be found with our ministry. And Paul clearly sees himself as the servant of God, the one called to announce the good news of Jesus Christ to the non-Jews. Paul is saying he is the chosen vessel. And Paul is making it clear that this is his only goal. There'll be no money made. There'll be no fame, only making Christ known. Paul even points out what he has been through as the one sent to spread the good news. Paul writes, as servants of God, we have commended ourselves in every way through great endurance and affliction, hardship, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, and hunger. So how has Paul proven himself to be God's servant? Paul points out that the people who have known him will testify that his life and his ministry have been single-minded and exemplary. Paul's ministry has been earmarked, as Paul writes, by purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, holiness of spirit, genuine love, truthful speech, and the power of God, with the weapons of righteousness for the right hand and for the left. Paul points out being a servant of God hasn't won him any favors. Paul has experienced, as he writes, honor and dishonor, ill repute and good repute. Paul says we're treated as impostors and yet are true. People have even wondered if Paul was dying or already dead. Paul writes that he is viewed as dying, and see, we are alive. Maybe one of the reasons Paul's letter to the Corinthians was written was to let the Christians know that Paul was still alive and he is still writing. Paul writes that he is viewed as punished and yet not killed, as sorrowful yet always rejoicing, as poor making many rich, as having nothing and yet possessing everything. Paul, in his commission to the apostle to the Gentiles, knew that in spite of his miserable life, his miserable experiences throughout his career, that he is God's chosen vessel to spread the good news of God's love through Jesus Christ, all people, Jews and non-Jews alike. Paul knew who he was. He was God's chosen servant. He was the one prophesied by Isaiah, and that self-realization that he is to send the light to the Gentiles gave his life great personal meaning and purpose and focus. It gave him resilience in the light of all that he had to do, and it gave him an undying passion to continue to do his work for as long as he could. We too, as believers in Jesus Christ, are called to share the good news. So how shall we do it? We all have a world where we can share the good news of God's love. How shall we do it? That should be the subject, our focus of prayer throughout our life. Until next time, God bless you.